Yeah, Charles, the floor is yours. Look forward to what you have to share with us today.
Thank you so much, Andy, for a very flattering and kind introduction. Thank you also, Bernadette. Sorry, I've taken my glasses off so I can't read this. And thank you all for coming, because I can say with complete honesty that doing things like this, engaging with universities generally, but specifically with individual students, is part of the job that I really enjoy more than anything else, because it's about real conversations, and it's always interesting and always challenging. So thank you all for coming, and I thank you in advance for your attention. Okay, the first thing I wanted to do was to touch on UK foreign policy. And here comes the first question to you. What reasons would a country have for employing diplomats? Why do diplomats exist? Why is there a foreign service of the United Kingdom, or of Kyrgyzstan, or of the United States, or of Pakistan, or wherever? Why do these things exist?
Espionage, also.
Espionage, that's, I wouldn't say it's part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but certain agencies in certain countries do engage in that.
It's not the ambassador's job.
It's not the ambassador's job, exactly. But foreign ministries do benefit from the product of those agencies.
And quite basically, no country exists in a sort of a state of bubble or a sort of bubble. So there's a huge array of questions which cannot be solved within the borders of one country.
Yeah.
The cooperation is necessary. So
That's a really good answer. So those are all, by and large, what makes up 95% of my working life. But I'll go into that in a bit more detail. In fact, the British Foreign Office came up quite recently, about sort of 4 or 5 years ago, with just 3 objectives for its existence. The first one is around prosperity. So that's all about promoting British exports. It's about promoting and supporting British investment overseas. It's about attracting foreign investment into the UK. There's that part of it, trade and investment. But there's also a wider prosperity piece. So we see it as in our interests to support Kyrgyzstan, for example, and any other country, to get richer. Because it's not just about benefit to Kyrgyzstan. There's a shared benefit from that. It's not a zero-sum game, in other words. British trade and investment, I won't go into this at any great length, but we have a huge interest here in gold mining. In fact, because of our interest in gold mining, Britain is one of the largest foreign investors in Kyrgyzstan, and it is the single largest export market for Kyrgyz goods, because all of that gold that is dug out of the ground in Kyrgyzstan is traded on the London Metal Exchange in the UK. The second of the 3 priorities is security. This is, for many countries, for many governments around the world, security and keeping the people secure in their country is their #1 priority. And it can't be done, this is back to your point, it cannot be done in isolation. Britain cannot keep its 68 million people secure unless it collaborates with countries around the world. And that's very much part of my work here. We do that in 2 ways. We collaborate bilaterally with the Kyrgyz government. So agencies like the British National Crime Agency, which is interested in questions like people trafficking and drug smuggling and the like, engage with its opposite number in the in Kyrgyzstan. And it's worth reflecting on that, because it shows just how global security questions are. I was talking to someone from our Border Force, which is the organisation that secures the border in the UK, and he pointed out to me that in effect there is only one border between Kyrgyzstan and the United Kingdom. And that's because Kyrgyzstan is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. So you can take your goods or your lorry or whatever it is all the way to Belarus, where there is a border with the European Union. That's the only border between this country and the UK, even though the UK has, of course, time zones away from here. So bilateral collaboration, and the other area is multilateral collaboration, and that's through what we call the rules-based international system. So the United Nations, of course, all the agencies that come with the United Nations, but also self-standing organisations like the Organisation for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons and the likes of those. We can't make those organisations work unless we all collaborate as much as we possibly can. And that's about security in a much wider sense. It's not just about terrorism or crime or anything. It's also about peacekeeping, for example. It's about climate change, which is one of the biggest and most strategic challenges that we face at the moment to our security because of the way it's impacting our countries and our economies and our societies. And it's about other areas which, by definition, can't be planned, like natural disasters and so on, which of course themselves have an impact on security. So that's the first two of the objectives, prosperity and security. The third is support to UK citizens around the world. And in this country, we don't have a huge number of British tourists, but they're coming in bigger numbers. And when they do come here, a lot of them engage in really quite dangerous things. They climb mountains, they ski down mountains, they go for long treks, and the like. And that tends to require support from the British Embassy. So that's UK foreign policy. I'd like to say now something about the wider picture in which that UK foreign policy is carried out, something about the geopolitical situation. One of the geopolitical changes that has been that has marked my career in the Foreign Office over the last 30 years has been the end of the Cold War at the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 90s, which of course is still impacting what's going on today in the world. But the second question I have for you is just to suggest other geopolitical changes. What are the geopolitical changes, the significant changes, which impact diplomacy and the work of a foreign diplomat? Big changes.
Different circumstances such as war.
Right. Exactly. So war in the Middle East. That's been a significant shift in the last decade.
Also, there are a lot of works like evidence about the so-called new Cold War concept. It's sort of a competition of global powers of the United States and China in a different format, and specifically it's a place where Europe, Russia, and within this context of great power competition.
Absolutely right. So that's about the way that the influential powers are shifting, the dynamics between them are shifting, exactly. Any other thoughts?
Consequences of the big game.
100 years on,
Yeah,
the
because it's
consequences
still-
that we're still seeing. That's definitely a factor. Any other ideas?
The impact of non-state actors,
Such as ISIS, exactly. And this goes back to the point about wars that have sprung up. Absolutely, it's a significant shift, which of course was going on long before 9/11, but was kind of brought into sharp focus by that sudden shock. So I'll mention a few others. I mean, I touched on the end of the Cold War. Of course, that was the end of what was, in retrospect, a relatively straightforward ideological battle between East and West. Those ideological struggles are over, and it led to significant shift in Europe, where the countries of Central and Eastern Europe came out from under Soviet influence and joined the European Union, joined NATO, and that was a significant shift. Of course, it meant the breakup of the Soviet Union, which produced 14 very different countries as a consequence, many of which are still developing themselves as newly independent states like Kyrgyzstan. And of course, in those circumstances, the world the alignment of countries within the world is much more complex than it used to be. In broad terms, you used to have East, West, and the non-aligned movement of some 77, 80 countries. Today, you have a much more complex picture as people build up different alliances all over the place. The other thing I mentioned is the rise of China. which has just been extraordinary in the last generation. It's had a significant impact, especially in terms of lifting people out of poverty. Hundreds of millions of Chinese people, literally, have been lifted out of absolute poverty and are contributing to what is an economic dynamo for the world. So very good in that respect. But there are other sides to the rise of China around human rights abuses. You just have to look over the border from Kyrgyzstan into Xinjiang to see what is going on there with the Uyghur community, even some ethnic Kyrgyz there as well, to see that it is not completely without its problems. And then the technology that's being developed there as well, and how that is being used, how that could possibly be used in the future as well, another factor in geopolitical change. I'd mentioned the internet. I mean, you know, we're using it now, of course, with the photographs you're going to post on Instagram, and we use it all the time to do our research, to send our messages and so on. That has fundamentally changed the way that countries interact, the way that diplomats do their jobs. I've mentioned extreme poverty and how, you know, more than 1 billion people in the last 25 years around the world have been lifted out of extreme poverty. That I can remember thinking at some 25, 30 years ago, that migration, which even then was a challenge for the UK and other countries in Europe, might become a less difficult subject to deal with as the rest of the world got richer. Because as the rest of the world got richer, so people would want to stay where they are and build businesses in their home countries. I was completely wrong. I got that completely upside down. In fact, the additional wealth that is being generated in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in countries like China, in Vietnam and so on, is enabling these people to get out and go and seek an even better position somewhere else. So migration, it has fed migration quite considerably, along with the internet, of course, which has given them the ideas, given them the openings, and is feeding what is, for a lot of countries around the world, whether they're transit countries or countries where people are leaving or destination countries, a significant geopolitical change. And security, we touched on that, and I won't go into it in any greater depth, but it is a much, much more complex picture today with non-state actors and particularly non-state actors who are prepared to go to much greater depth. So the rise of terror, I think, is something that needs mentioning. Okay, the next thing I wanted to talk about is why does the UK have an embassy in Kyrgyzstan? There are 51 countries in Europe, 51, and 47 of them do not have an embassy in Kyrgyzstan. There are just 4 European countries with an embassy here. Why would we go with that minority and not with the majority and save a bit of money?
As you peruse the UK has interest, and it had 100 years. We have like started way back, and for natural resources, you have. I mean, you are putting a lot of money in the economy, and you see the benefit. So you are here,
Right.
and
Yes,
basic.
exactly. Any other thoughts on that?
Maybe because it's Kyrgyzstan is the most democratic country in Central Asia.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point, yes. You're absolutely right. Any other thoughts?
Maybe because the UK is one of the most important leaders in the European Union, and we also have the embassy from Germany, So.
Right, and that is an absolutely correct reflection of why it happens, or at least it's a reflection of the fact that as one of the largest EU member states, we have always had an outward-looking approach and the resources to go out and do something about it. Exactly right. So, I mean, in short, we have an embassy here because we can contribute to all 3 of those objectives I mentioned. We can contribute to Britain's prosperity, our collective prosperity, our collective security, and we can help look after British citizens while they're here. And the point about sort of working with Kyrgyzstan is all about collaboration. I mean, collaboration, which was mentioned earlier, is absolutely what achieving things in foreign policy is all about. You can't do it on your own. And that's very much the case with security, but it's the case with just about any international subject that we care about. So take protection of endangered species, for example. These are trafficked across borders. You can't do it on your own. You have to collaborate. So you work together with other countries to come up with collective solutions, and you become more effective. Poverty is another one. You can work. It's a prosperity thing. Health is a third one. Again, diseases, endemic diseases do not recognise modern national state borders. So you have to collaborate between them. Again, that's an area where we do that. Another reason is that the British Foreign Ministry has taken the view that in order to be fully effective, to meet the needs of the British people, we have to, as much as possible, have global reach. There are very few countries around the world which really aim for global reach. The United States is one, Britain is another, France does, China does. Russia does not to quite the same degree, although they're pushing back in that direction. Germany, interestingly, doesn't have quite the same number of embassies around the world. But it's that relatively small group which really goes for global reach. And one of the reasons we do that is education, actually. We view the links that we can stimulate between foreign students and British universities as one of the most important parts of positioning the UK around the world and protecting our interests. And in order to do that, we have to be present around the world in order to offer scholarships to students from other countries, in order to advertise British universities, in order to keep the links between people who have had some sort of British educational experience. And we do that through, some of you may have heard of the Chevening Scholarship Program. It's a postgraduate scholarship which we send some 6, 7, 8 Kyrgyz students to the UK to do a master's degree each year. And if you have any interest in studying in the UK to do a master's, then I would thoroughly recommend that you look at that as one of the options. We also have a lot of programs in this country, by which I mean projects where we're collaborating with partners in Kyrgyzstan in order to support the security objective and the prosperity objective that I talked about. So examples of that are a program we're just setting up, which is a 4-year program to set up a network of business incubators in Bishkek, in Osh, in Jalabad, and in other towns around the country, in order to support the small and medium-sized business sector in Kyrgyzstan, because this is a really important part of generating prosperity, of generating wealth in Kyrgyzstan. Small and medium-sized businesses create new job opportunities, and they spread wealth very rapidly. So there is an example of a project we're doing. Another example where we're in collaboration with the Aga Khan Development Network is around rebuilding irrigation channels in border districts in Kyrgyzstan, on the border with Tajikistan, the border with Uzbekistan, to help those communities both stimulate their own local agricultural business, but also to reduce the causes of the kind of conflicts that happen on the border zone. So there's both a prosperity opportunity there and a security opportunity. Freedom of expression. So, I mean, you talked about democracy and the like, and you're absolutely right. One of the great opportunities we have in Kyrgyzstan comes out of the fact that it is unique, this country, in Central Asia, in allowing freedom of expression. There is no other country in Central Asia which would have published the articles that we saw published in Kulp and Azaktik earlier this week. That is an amazing opportunity for this country, actually. And it's not the only example. When I came out here in July, one of the first things I was dealing with was reporting back to London on the attempt to arrest President Atambayev, former President Atambayev. That, of course, happened. And in the days and weeks that followed, there was a lot in the media here which was critical of the president himself, President Jernbekov, also critical of the way that the government had handled the events on the 7th and 8th of August. And again, that kind of criticism does not happen in many countries. It's a really valuable thing which Kyrgyzstan has there. And we can use that in order to help develop democracy, to help develop the rule of law, and indeed to spread that to other countries which might themselves want to develop freedom of expression and democracy, but don't quite know how to do it. So in that sense, Kyrgyzstan is a very important partner for not just Britain, but for other Western and other partners in the country in Central Asia. And I have to say that in all of this work around freedom of expression, around democracy, around irrigation channels, around prosperity, security and so on, it is extraordinary how much progress Kyrgyzstan has made in the 30 years since it won independence. It is a really quite impressive track record in terms of society, social development, economic development, political development. And I'm very proud that the UK has had a small part, even a small part, to play in collaborating in producing that. And very proud that I personally now have an opportunity to spend 3 or 4 years working with that. So, the last piece, my typical day, just to give you, I've talked a lot about the sort of wider theory around this, but I wanted to give you a few practical examples of what I do on a day-to-day basis. And here's the fourth question. What do you think I do all day long? Meetings? Who do I meet? Other ambassadors?
Yeah, other ambassadors. Maybe business people.
Ministry people.
Ministry and business people.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think you wake up first.
Right? But not always.
And maybe exercise. Then I think you first meet with the embassy stuff to get updates on local issues or news, and then a meeting with the staff, and then maybe meeting with public officials or government officials, and negotiations.
Any other ideas?
I think apart from these official things that you might be that you are doing, one should be also going around to see how people live, how the social life looks like. And I think you should be doing that as well.
Great idea.
Posting Twitter in the Twitter, because that's where I know you from, and that's where you're extremely popular.
Right, yes, there is that, and I'll come back to that in a minute.
You have daily texts from your ministry that tells you what to do.
Yeah, exactly. So communication.
Yeah, communication, and you need to report regarding those stuff that they gave you. So I think you first start from those tasks, and if you have time, you add some meetings with other people.
They wake up later.
Yeah, they do actually. And that's really helpful. I get into the embassy and London are fast asleep, so you can make some progress in the morning. They wake up around sort of 2 in the afternoon, 3 in the afternoon, and at that point the email inbox just goes ding, 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 ding like this. So I try to be outside the embassy when that happens. But yes, I mean that's broadly it. We do a fair amount of planning, because obviously you can't work without understanding what you're going to be doing over the next period. We report back to London, so the publication of the revelations about Matraimov and Abdukazanov and all of that. London, of course, are very interested to hear about that. We'll be reporting that back. We do a fair amount of lobbying, so human rights lobbying, where we're meeting, these are the meetings with government officials and so on, but also on international organisation issues. So if there's something where we see that in the UN in New York, we want to build a group of collaborative countries, then we can speak to the Kyrgyz here and try and bring them on side in New York. We do a lot of engaging just on day-to-day issues with government, with business, with media, with others. I travel around the country. I mean, this is your point about sort of seeing the country. If I spent my whole time speaking to other ambassadors, I would know a tiny fraction of 0.001% of the truth about this country. Ambassadors themselves, and I'll let you into a secret, often know considerably less about a country than the collective understanding of the embassy and all the embassy's contacts. So it's really important to spend a lot of time talking to those people, really important to get out of the embassy as often as possible, and indeed to speak to people who just do normal things in the country. The kind of people we often come into contact with, business people and government officials and so on, tend to be right up at the top of a country, and they have a particular view. But the people who are, digging farmers' fields, or who are trying to set up a small business in Karakol, for example, these are people who have an equally valid, in many cases, a more valid view of what's going on in the country. It's very important to engage with them as well. So that's kind of it. I just wanted to give a last word about communication, but I promised to come back to that. It's one of the things that has changed most in the course of my career as a diplomat. When I joined, most people, in fact everyone, got their information from basically three sources. They got it from the TV, from the radio, and from newspapers. And everyone going into work would buy a newspaper and sit on the train or the bus or whatever it is and read the newspaper. And they would get to work feeling as though they now understood what things were. But of course the newspaper had been printed 12 hours before, so they were already a bit behind by the time they got. And in the old days, whereas we used to make friends with editors and journalists on those traditional broadcast and other media in order to get messages out through there, we can now do it direct from our desks with our own accounts. And the embassy has essentially six accounts on social media. It has accounts run by Urmat here, which are the UK and Kyrgyzstan accounts on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. And it has my personal accounts on the same. When I say personal, it is more personal, but of course it is me as a British diplomat. And with those six accounts, we not only follow what's going on, it's very useful for that, to hear what other people are saying, but we also put out the messages that we believe help to support our work on those three objectives which I mentioned earlier around prosperity and security and supporting British people. And just to give you an idea of that kind of messaging, a current one, yesterday the United Nations started one of their periodic campaigns, this one on the elimination of violence against women, and they'll be running it for 16 days. So they will be putting out a lot of messages about why it's bad to have violence against women and what society should be doing to protect women against that. And we, because we support the United Nations very strongly in that, and we agree with their view on it, will also be putting out messages on the same thing, as will a number of other embassies around Bishkek. So you'll be able to see those on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. And here is another offer, okay? There is another prize in the bag that Urmat brought with her today for the person who can come up with the best message to help support this campaign of eliminating violence against women. So have a think while we're having the question and answers, and come up with those messages. How are we going to get those messages out to us?
Twitter, Instagram, Facebook,
Right, okay.
whatever.
So put them there. The best one that we think, the best one that Urmat thinks is the best one, will receive a further prize. So get thinking and put those up with the hashtag. That's all I've got to say. I'm very happy to answer questions because I know that there are probably areas you'd like to explore a bit more, areas I haven't touched on at all, in which case I'm very happy to do it. And do range as wide as you want. I'm very happy to answer questions about my work, any aspect of my work. Very happy to answer questions about the principles and theory of foreign policy and geopolitics and so on. Very happy to answer questions about my personal life as well. It's just all completely open.
Well, Charles, thank you so much for a really thoughtful overview of British foreign policy, your day, your work day, activities here in Kyrgyzstan. So if anybody who wants to ask a question, when you ask the question, let's keep it brief, not an extended commentary, please, and identify yourself for the ambassador. And maybe I'll exercise the prerogative of the chair and ask Ambassador Jared the first question. I'm curious about what the anticipation of Brexit. What kind of impact that is having on foreign policy planning now? Is there a process that's taking place in the foreign ministry? And is that engaging you and the embassy here? And do you anticipate that how much would this affect British foreign policy?
It's a really interesting question, and it's a very difficult one to answer because we don't know what the relationship is going to be between Britain and the European Union once Britain has left. There is even a possibility that Britain will not leave the European Union. If you're a betting person, you might want to put a very small amount of money on that. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Britain will leave the European Union, and I'm also confident that we will develop a very collaborative and constructive, positive relationship with the European Union because we share so many interests, both in terms of social interests, economic interests, geopolitical interests. So it's very much there's very strong reason why we should come up with a very close working relationship after Brexit. But going beyond that and looking at the detail of what that means is very much more difficult. What will a trading relationship with the European Union look like after Brexit? How much will we actually engage with them, and in what structures? Will we have regular contact in Brussels? Will it be in London? Will there be kind of structures tapped onto the side of the European Union institutions? Who knows? I mean, these are all things that are talked about, and they would all have an influence on the way that the relationship worked. As for the Foreign Office in London, we do look ahead beyond Brexit. There's been an enormous amount of contingency planning going on in London for the different scenarios that might be what happens after Brexit. And who knows, if we're lucky, maybe one of those contingency plans will actually be where we end up. But I'm confident about it all. And the last point I've mentioned actually is that if Brexit has had a powerful positive impact on the way that we do our strategic planning, it is certainly in the area that it has forced us to look more globally than we have done in the last sort of 20, 30 years, where so much of our foreign policy thinking was sort of channeled through collaboration with 27 other member states of the European Union. We talk about this concept of global Britain now, which is about, sort of building those bilateral, those direct contacts with other countries around the world. So I think that's one area where there will be change.
Empire comes back. Okay. Yes, sir.
I just want to go straight forward to the question.
Identify yourself, please.
My name is Ahmed Hamid Arman, and I'm a sophomore student of ICP. Thanks for coming, Mr. Ambassador. So the question is that the UK ex-Prime Minister Tony Blair said to mix a general election act with the specific issue of Brexit is wrong in principle and it's wrong in the politics, BBC News. So why does not the British government reconduct a detailed referendum regarding Britain's divorce from EU? And my second question will go, how will the United Kingdom deal with the supporters of Scotland independence after a no deal Brexit? Thank you.
I forgot my other rule. One question per person.
Okay, you get half answers to each. The question about the election. The referendum happened. There needs to be a democratic consequence, an answer to that referendum, where 52% of the British people said we ought to leave the European Union. That task then passed to the Parliament, and Parliament found it impossible to come up with a final answer to how exit from the EU would happen. Under those circumstances, it became increasingly difficult, in fact, impossible for Parliament to continue functioning, which is why an election became inevitable. And I think you have to see the two things, the referendum and the parliamentary process, in different areas, if you like. You can't You can't bring them together in the way that that quotation does. What was the second question about no deal?
How UK will deal with supporters of Scotland independence?
Scotland independence, right, yes, okay. So, I don't believe there will be a no-deal Brexit. I think there will be a deal, whatever the outcome of the election on the 12th of December. Because again, that is so obviously in everyone's interest to do it. So I don't think there will be a no-deal Brexit. But the question about Scottish independence does remain, clearly. My own view, and I think the government's view, is that having had a referendum on Scottish independence in 2015, i.e. just 4 years ago, now is not the time to be having another one. It's about moving on. It's a once-in-a-generation thing. We need to come back to it at a later stage.
Please,
I'm Hafiz from Afghanistan, a senior student of our ICP department. I had, again, a question on Brexit. So there are a lot of debates on Brexit since it happened, and it has been delayed several times. The deadline has been extended. And as you said, although this happened, there are still a lot of interests and values that the UK is sharing with other European member states. But because there has been, a lot of debate and it has been prolonged, do you think it was a mistake? If not, what was it that it has been debated so much and has been delayed several times?
I think it's largely a consequence of the fact that the country is split on this. I mean, although 52-48 is a clear answer, it's a we're going to leave the European Union type of response. Actually, it's not that far apart, right? You've got roughly half the country who support leaving, half the country who support staying. And under those circumstances, it's very difficult to take people in one direction or the other without massive opposition. And that opposition comes in all sorts of forms. And it's interesting to look at the divide in terms of support for Brexit and opposition to Brexit within the Parliament at Westminster. In the Parliament that's just finished, it was something in the region of 75 to 80% against Brexit. So you had a Parliament which was essentially reluctant to carry out the instruction of the people in the referendum. And that caused a further difficulty in taking it forward.
So I can't help but think about one of my favorite Clash songs, Should I Stay or
Should I Go? Yeah, absolutely. It's been done to death in terms of documentaries about Brexit.
Yes, ma'am, then we've got you next.
Firstly, thank you for coming. Charles Garrett OBE as a student of politics. My name is Jeff, I'm a senior politics major, and I have my thesis on Brexit. And I wanted to ask, so there are three kinds of Brexit that are thought to be. Soft Brexit, that's attributed to May. It supposes some like visa restrictions and the presence of the Irish backstop. So there's also hard Brexit that's credited to Boris Johnson. There's an option of no Brexit at all. So which one do you think is the best and most likely for the UK foreign policy? From your perspective.
Well, the one that Boris Johnson had was actually very similar to the one that Theresa May came up with. It changed some of the elements around the island of Ireland and how trade within that island would happen. But beyond that, it wasn't significantly different from it. And I think that, I mean, this is a personal view, of course. I think that is probably the most likely outcome. But as I say, it's a very, very fluid situation where things could change dramatically. It's difficult in the context of the election to predict who's going to be forming the next government after the 12th of December. And that, of course, will have a significant impact. If Boris Johnson brings the Conservative Party back into power, he will almost certainly pursue the deal that he struck with Brussels. If Jeremy Corbyn comes to power, then he's made it clear that he will take a different approach. He will go back to Brussels to try to renegotiate it. If you have a coalition in which the Liberal Democrats come about, then there is the possibility of of a second referendum. There's the possibility, in fact, of just stopping Article 50, i.e. the departure process. So, I mean, all of those are possible, even if not probable. And it's very difficult to say which one's most likely to come out.
Yes.
Hello, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Gary. I'm from Israel. I'm an ICP student from. I study ICP. I'm senior student, and my question is like this: that during this summer, the Iranian regime took over oil tanker that was in the open sea. So that happened because of the sanctions that fall on the Iranian regime. So my question is how this event actual influence on the Iranian-British relations, and what was the reaction of the British government to such a big event?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you know, I'm not a specialist on relations with Iran, but it was a well-publicised event which attracted quite a lot of the world's attention because it was quite a provocative event and one that required very careful handling. The approach was really to play a firm line in terms of sanctions, but also to attempt to not to back the Iranian government into a corner, which would make it more difficult to resolve it in a peaceful and satisfactory way all around. I mean, there were actually two tanker stories going on, more than two tanker stories going on. There was the British one that I think you're referring to, the British flagged vessel, which was taken in the Gulf, and that was ultimately released. So I think that can be seen as a success for that particular approach. The other one that I was thinking of was the tanker carrying Iranian crude, which was seized off Gibraltar by the British authorities, and that one was a slightly less satisfactory outcome in that it, of course, as you know, sailed on to the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yes.
I'm Majesty from Afghanistan, sophomore student at ICP. If you get back to directly that question on that, why do you think that Britain's vote for Brexit, while they were aware of the ill consequences, even some people whose business and lives were contributed and influenced positively by the EU, believe for the Brexit? Was that it's been said that even if the referendum happens again, the result would be vice versa?
I think there are many answers to that question, actually. I think one of the sort of the general answers is that the European Union typically has been quite bad at presenting all the advantages that membership brings to the countries and the citizens of those countries within it. There is a lot of investment from the European Commission in the United Kingdom, in the poorer areas of the United Kingdom. But awareness of that investment is very low indeed. That's one part of the answer. Another part of the answer, I think, is that some people, even where they're aware of an advantage of being a citizen in a member state of the European Union, they decide that actually the disadvantages outweigh the advantages. So they might see, for example, that the need to compromise over policy in Brussels is a disadvantage. They might see, for example, that the need to have open borders and unlimited migration from other member states of the European Union is a disadvantage. There are examples like that, and then there are all sorts of fake news around it as well. The stories around Brussels banning a particular type of product in the UK. You're no longer allowed to buy your beer in a pint glass. You have to buy it in a half-litre glass. That kind of thing, which of course is nonsense, but also has an impact on people. There are almost certainly other reasons out there, if you look at the way that the referendum voting pattern happened across the UK, I think that also reflects the understanding and the perception of membership. London, of course, voted very strongly in favour of staying in the European Union, because they see every day the benefits, the commercial benefits, the social benefits, and so on. Areas in perhaps post-industrial parts of the north of England voted very strongly against staying in the European Union because they see very little advantage. There's perhaps sort of not very much by way of EU support to their areas, or they might see that the jobs are being given to people from other parts of the European Union and that they resent that. There are many different reasons for it.
Okay, I've got 3 gentlemen in the queue. I would like to reserve the next question to a woman, bring a little more gender equality to the discussion. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so recently the Labour Party pledged to have free broadband by 2030. So in my opinion, that's obviously an election ploy, but if they succeed in the election, how do you think that that's going to be carried out? Do you think that it's even possible to have free broadband service?
It's an interesting question. I should preface my remarks with the fact that we have a practice in the UK for civil servants of what we call PERDA, which is, you may already know about this, but it's essentially pre-election silence. British officials are not allowed to comment on policy or election issues or manifestos of political parties during it. But I think it's a particularly interesting question to ask about nationalisation of broadband. Because, of course, there are complaints about the provision of broadband in Britain, just as there are in every country, because not everyone gets the fastest or most reliable broadband that they want, so people complain about it. And it's one way of addressing those complaints.
Okay, back to the queue. Yes.
Sorry, I can't be more explicit.
Thank you very much for coming. I am Hilal from Tajikistan, a sophomore student at ICP Department. My question is, any change has happened in the perception of the UK citizens toward Brexit since 2016? And do they have any concern toward this?
Yes, there are people with concerns about Brexit, definitely. There are those who really want the UK to remain in the European Union, and they are very worried about it. And you hear that in London, in the UK generally, the whole time. But apart from that, there's quite an interesting answer to the first part of your question, which is that, of course, people's understanding of what Brexit means has changed significantly since the referendum. At the time of the referendum, people did not really know what the relationship with the European Union would be in the future. They did not know what the withdrawal would look like. And as that has become clearer because of the negotiations and because of the deals that have been published, so people's understanding has become much better. But what's interesting about this is that actually it hasn't had that much effect on the overall support or opposition to Brexit. The numbers in successive polls over the last 3.5 years since the referendum have been remarkably constant. It's still roughly splitting the country in two.
And what are these concerns that people possess?
Well, people have all sorts of different concerns. Some of those concerns are the big strategic concerns. We live in a globalised world. So what you need in a globalised world is more collaboration and more working together than you used to have. Leaving the European Union is not an example of that. That's one kind of generalised strategic concern. But then you get very personal ones as well. In my family, one of my sisters is married to a French man. My brother lives and works with his family in Germany. They have interests, social interests, very personal ones, across borders, which of course, membership of the European Union means you can carry out your life in a very easy way. Leaving the European Union raises questions about how you're going to do that. And so those as well, and 101 different types of questions.
Yes, sir.
Thank you once again for your presentation. I'm Sharon from Politics Department. And my question is more or less personal. Did you ever disagree with what your Minister of Foreign Affairs were asking you to do? And if not, why do you think that happened? Why do you think you didn't disagree?
That's a fantastic question, Charles, because it goes to the heart of what it is to be a civil servant in a democracy. And our civil service is based on certain values, the most important of which is that as a civil servant, you can have political views, but you keep those quiet, and you always serve the government of the day. So whoever is the Minister, the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, I have to do what he or she wants me to do. And that is a fundamental principle. And I have to say that one of the proudest moments in my career as a British civil servant was on the 24th of June 2016, like the day after the referendum on Brexit, where you had the results of the referendum coming out, and a foreign ministry which had been sort of heading in that direction, serving the United Kingdom as a member of the European Union, suddenly had to turn round in that direction and head off without any complaint at all. And that is essentially what happened. People came into work that morning, it was a Friday, and they sat down and thought, well, what does this mean for British policy? What does this mean for the way I do my work? And got on with providing the thinking and the analysis and the advice to ministers that they would need. And they put it up, and it was an extraordinary thing to see it. And it wasn't just the foreign ministry, it was the whole of government actually doing that. I'm glad to say that in my whole career, I have never had a moment when I have so fundamentally disagreed with a policy that the government wanted me to be part of carrying out, that I've been in a difficult situation. Looking back on some of the events that have happened during my career, I can identify times when Britain has made foreign policy mistakes. That's absolutely clear. I mean, every country does. And occasionally I've been part of that. But it wasn't the case at the moment, at the time of it happening, that I thought, this is a fundamental mistake, this is something I really disagree with, this is something I have a problem with. So I've been very lucky in that regard. But it's not the case in every country.
Just to follow up on that question, as you know, with the election of Donald Trump, a lot of the most senior U.S. Foreign Service officers and distinguished diplomats have simply decided to retire early. Did not want to work with this administration in the beginning. And certainly, this instance, while I've never been a diplomat that having followed U.S. foreign policy, has been, I'd say, the most divisive and demoralizing for the Foreign Service of the United States in the last 40 years. And there have been plenty of other mistakes, but this has been very, very tough for them. Is there if you had to pick one or two incidents in the last 30 to 40 years, you may not have thought about retiring, but where you knew a number of your colleagues were very, very upset and decided to retire or were very close to retiring?
Well, I can think of two areas of foreign policy which have been extremely controversial at the time. One of which I was involved in, which was the negotiations with China about the handover of Hong Kong from British sovereignty to Chinese sovereignty. And the other is the Iraq War, and Britain's role as part of the alliance there. So the first one, the argument was all about the degree of democracy that we should leave Hong Kong with in 1997 before it was handed over to China. There were huge rows about that, and my personal views at the time were very much in line with the last governor of Hong Kong, who was pursuing quite a hard line. He wanted maximum democracy in Hong Kong before 1997. And I think that unfortunately, a lot of recent developments in the territory of Hong Kong have probably shown that he was right in that regard. The other one, on the Iraq War, at the time, I agreed with the British policy on what was going on. I had access to the same facts and the same analysis about it, and I drew the same conclusions as our political masters did. But I know that a lot of my colleagues did not in the Foreign Office, Some of them, especially those who had built careers in the Middle East, felt very difficult, in a very difficult position about it. I'm not aware of many people resigning over it, but I do know that it caused significant upset. But again, you know, the Foreign Ministry ultimately came together in order to provide what the political masters were asking us to do.
I have to follow up on Hong Kong. I was planning on asking this question later since you've been posted in Hong Kong. It looks like the two sides are really deadlocked in a very kind of dangerous, well, what we in North America we call a Mexican standoff. But what is your view of this? And how do you see a good ending, or how would a good ending come about?
There's a fundamental problem here, which goes back to the difficulties that we had during the negotiation of the handover arrangement. Excuse me. That argument around the level of democracy in Hong Kong was often characterized by people who said democracy is a Western construct which just doesn't have a place in East Asian societies. Show us a Chinese society which is democratic, they said. And at the time, it was very difficult to answer that beyond the general point that democracy and human rights are not just Western values, they actually are values shared by people around the whole world. But of course, since then, another country that I've worked in, I shouldn't say country actually, another place that I've worked in is Taiwan. And there you have had a society, Taiwanese society, which of course is largely Chinese, it's 98% Chinese, which has developed an incredibly strong democracy. In the last 20 years or so, they've had 3 or 4 democratic and peaceful transfers of power from one side of politics to the other and back again. They have, for example, passed a law supporting gay marriage, which 20 years ago in East Asia was just unthinkable. You know, this is a society which is stable, prosperous, democratic, forward-thinking, and Chinese. And so, you know, if we'd had that example back then, the conversation might have been a bit different. But the tensions that shows are what are being played out on the streets now in Hong Kong. And I think that, you know, that one of the factors that has led to that has been around an unwillingness to compromise over it. The negotiations over Hong Kong, of course, envisaged that the place would have universal suffrage. Voting to the Legislative Council, the parliamentary body that runs Hong Kong, would be done by one person, one vote. Everyone would have a vote, and all of the seats would be done on that basis. But sadly, the government in Beijing have pushed back against that, and that has raised the temperature among the people who support a greater level of democracy in Hong Kong. And that's one of the points. So, I mean, coming to the sort of the nub of your question about do I see a good outcome to this, or what a good outcome looks like, I think the only way you can have a good outcome is if there is a belated recognition that some sort of democracy, some sort of compromise is going to be necessary. That they're not just going to be able to hit these democratic supporters back into their box and carry on as before. Because if they try to do that, it's just going to get worse in Hong Kong.
Thanks. Okay, we've got back to some more. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. My name is Sabur, and I'm a fourth-year student of the ICP department. My question was regarding the Chinese initiative, One Belt and One Road. Is there anything that the Britain feel threatened here, or British interests feel threatened by this initiative? Or is there anything specifically that you as an ambassador is involved or discussing about the future of this project?
You mean in Hong Kong?
No, here in Kyrgyzstan.
Here, sorry, I missed the first part. The initiative to...
One Belt, One Road. One
Belt, One Road.
Yeah.
One Belt, One Road, of course, is an enormous initiative. It has so many different angles to it. And it's not surprising, therefore, that it brings both tremendous opportunity and some risk as well. And very often those two things are very closely interlinked. I mean, the obvious opportunity is about providing a way for Kyrgyzstan to be properly linked into the rest of the region, to increase its communications, to strengthen its ability to trade and travel and communicate more widely and globally, actually. And that really, I mean, it is an enormous opportunity. I mean, I was talking today to a colleague who has come over from Dushanbe. You can't travel direct from Dushanbe to Bishkek. Now that's, you know, crazy. Of course, it won't necessarily be affected by the Belt and Road Initiative, but that is just an illustration of how weak communications infrastructure are in the region. So that is a very big opportunity. But the risk comes with the projects that are funded by countries like Kyrgyzstan in all of this. Debt levels in this country are troubling, I have to say. A report that I heard about recently, done by an academic at Harvard University in the States, showed that by 2025, this country is going to be having to find every year $393 million in order to repay its debt over the infrastructure projects. It simply doesn't have that money. So it's going to have to find a way of rescheduling that over a longer term in order to make the repayments more manageable. You know, for any country to be in that situation introduces all sorts of risks, and not just around the debt itself, but of course it squeezes the government's ability to spend on all the other aspects that taxpayers would expect around schooling and health and transport within the country and pensions and what have you. So it's a complicated picture, and it's not just opportunities, it's also risks.
Just to put a number on that, that would be about 5% per year of Kyrgyzstan's GDP.
Right. Yeah.
Just on debt payment for Belt and Road. Yeah, it does.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Verdastovsky, and I'm a sophomore from ICP department. Mr. Ambassador, coming from Afghanistan, the tension of power in the region, despite being something most of the time very irrelevant to our interest, is quite interesting for me. The recent economic developments in Afghanistan and the rule of the United States shows that the diplomacy in the region is shifting toward a path in which the education and empowerment of youth would be one of the main elements in development of a nation state. Last time when I wrote and heard, United States was providing $345 million in 2019 for economic developments. And I wouldn't comment on that this time, but AUCA is possibly one of the best investments they have done so far. And I would like to know what you think about the role of institutions such as AUCA in the region.
Well, I mean, education is all, right? Yeah, I mean, this is not just the case in Afghanistan or in Kyrgyzstan, it's the case in Britain and the United States, everywhere. You know, the more educated the people of your country, the more you can exploit the opportunities that come up, the more you can have creative approaches to problem solving, the more you can contribute to prosperity, to just about any aspect of society, actually. So AUCA is a fantastic addition to not just Kyrgyzstan, but regional development, in my view. And it sits alongside you know, all sorts of other initiatives like UCA in Narin as well, supported by the Aga Khan Foundation, and the development of other universities here in Bishkek as well, as a you know, a significant part of hope for the future.
Yes.
My name is Anita. I'm a sophomore in ICP department. So my question is regarding Brexit. Why UK wants to deal with immigrants while immigrants are contributing a lot to the productivity and to the economy of this country?
Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt in the government's mind that migration into the UK, just as migration out of the UK, is an essential part of the modern United Kingdom. Our economy simply would not function if we didn't have the ability to attract talent and people from outside the United Kingdom. And I don't think that is ever going to change, actually. I think the question around migration is really one not so much about numbers even of migrants coming in, but it's about the way that migrants change communities. It's really about fear of change, not fear of migrants. So, for example, in London, as I mentioned earlier, which was very strongly in support of Brexit, people there just don't think about migration because London is a city of 8 or 9 million migrants, essentially, either from within the UK or from outside the UK. And everyone recognises that it's part of the city's success. Other parts of the UK, for example, rural towns, much smaller, maybe 20,000 people, who have been doing things their own way for centuries and centuries and centuries, often with the same people tracing their families back in the same town for generation after generation. Suddenly, you have an influx of, for example, agricultural workers who are brought in to pick the lettuces in the fields or what have you. And they want to have access to their own thing. So if you go back 20 years, a lot of these people were Polish workers who came from Poland, and they would set up Polish shops in the high street. More recently, you've had Lithuanians coming in, and they would set up Lithuanian shops in the high street. And the original inhabitants of the town see that, and it unsettles them, and it makes them feel a bit nervous about what's going on to the town that they're known for years and years and years and has been unchanged. It's those kind of fears, I think, that generate the opposition to migration. But genuinely, there is generally in the UK, there is a very strong understanding that migration is an essential part of being a modern country in the world.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. I know you've had your hand up, but I want to make sure that everybody who hasn't asked a question is...
Yeah. Hi, my name is Nick Wilson. I'm a faculty member here at ALSA. From the biographical information we were sent about you, by my estimation, you've served under 7 British Prime Ministers since 1987. I think that's about right. And of course, only 1 head of state. I'm just wondering, well, first of all, one kind of very simple question. What drew you to foreign service in the first place? What made you want to pursue a career in diplomacy? And consequently, considering the amount of time that you've presumably spent outside of the United Kingdom, and I myself actually lived outside the UK for 11 years now, how have you found your own perceptions, your own image of the United Kingdom changing over that time? Do you now, things that you grew up with, as a Brit, do they now seem strange to you? Do they now seem weird to you?
Yeah.
I've become a total coffee drinker. I don't drink tea anymore, for example.
It's a great question. And a lot of people who don't, I'll take a step back actually. I went into, when I left university, it was at a time when a lot of young British graduates were going into the financial services sector. We had just deregulated the City of London, and it was just exploding and becoming a sort of a global financial powerhouse. And I was part of that, and I went and got a job in an investment bank in the City of London. I realised after about 3 months that I didn't really enjoy it, and I stuck it out for about a year, and then I left. And I sat down and thought long and hard about what I wanted to do. And the thing that I liked, when I bought a copy of the newspaper, because we bought newspapers in those days, the 2 sections I used to go to first were the back pages about sport, to read football, and then the sort of pages sort of 4, 5, 6, which were foreign stuff. I was much less interested in the latest murder in Birmingham or sort of British economic news or what have you. It was sport and it was foreign affairs. I didn't think I could get a job in sport, but the Foreign Office was an obvious way of getting access to all of that sort of overseas interest. I had grown up largely overseas. I spent a lot of my childhood in Russia and in Austria and in Germany, and I'd studied Russian at university. So I had a sort of an understanding already that the world didn't start and finish in the UK. So I applied to the Foreign Office and luckily got in and was able to pursue that. And interestingly, it didn't take very long for me to understand that the first question people would ask me as a civil servant in the Foreign Office or as a diplomat was, gosh, it must be such a culture shock when you go overseas. You're going to Kyrgyzstan. What a culture shock, But the truth is, it's not a culture shock at all, because that's what I want to do. I come to a country like Kyrgyzstan with my arms open and my mind open, and I absorb anything that's different about culture, because that's my job. That's what I want to do, and it's not a shock at all. It's like diving into a warm swimming pool. It's beautiful. The culture shock, though, comes when you return to the UK. To answer the sort of the last bit of your question, you come back to the UK and you see a country, you see a society which you know intimately from before. And there's an expression in English which is familiarity breeds contempt. And you see this place which still hasn't moved on. It's still got the same sort of ridiculous sort of ideas about this or that or the other. And that is the real culture shock, actually, to go back there and see that culture that you knew years before. But it does move on. I mean, I can remember once I came back from a posting in Switzerland in 2001, and I remember going to South Kensington in London, which used to be a very middle-class British community, and walking down the street there and hearing people speaking French. I thought, what's going on? People don't speak French in London. But of course, that was just the start of it, actually. And it was the influx of people, French bankers and businessmen and Germans and Swedes and all the others coming and buying houses in South Kent.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm just continuing this question. I would ask you, tell us, there are lots of aspiring students who are studying political science, so what is the single strongest advice that you would give us in becoming ambassadors?
Single.
One single that we should keep in mind always.
To help you become an ambassador, or to help you be an ambassador when you've become one?
To help you become.
Read. Yes. Just read and read and read and read, and carry on reading. And then when you've got, sort of no books left, ask someone else for some books. That is the single most important thing you can do.
Probably less of the sports page and more of the world
Yeah.
affairs section. Although I share the exact same newspaper reading habits. Yes.
Hi, Ambassador. My name is Hizbullah Shafat. I'm from Afghanistan. Thanks for coming here and thanks for the great advice. I have a question regarding Brexit and UK's foreign policy. There is a high possibility that the Brexit will take place, and of course it will affect the UK's foreign policy towards certain countries and issues. What changes should we expect in UK's mission in Central Asia, and especially in Afghanistan? If that's going to be very interesting for me because I'm coming from the society. Mindful of the points that UK's mission, like UK's troop withdraw from in Afghanistan around 2014. So what changes should we expect after Brexit?
I think there's a strong argument that you won't see very much change, actually. Britain's position in the world today depends to some degree on its membership of the European Union. But to a much bigger degree, it depends on the fact that it's one of 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. It's the only member of NATO which spends more than 2% of its GDP and also spends 0.7% of its GDP on overseas development assistance, which which is a very powerful combination. It is, of course, a member of the Commonwealth of Nations, which is a group of some 50 or more countries, including India and Australia and Canada and so on, which gives us another network for global engagement. It's through all of these really very powerful tools and channels that Britain builds its collaboration around the world. And those won't be affected by leaving the EU. If anything, we will put more effort and more resources into building collaboration through those channels. So I think, if anything, you can see a growth in Britain's engagement in just about any place where Britain is already engaged.
And the last question goes right here.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Shahida. I'm a junior student of ICP Program. My question is that what message does the Brexit give to other Eurosceptic countries?
Our view is that a relationship between any European Union member state and the European Union itself is absolutely for that country to decide on. I mean, when we were before the referendum in 2016, we were always viewed as one of the more Eurosceptic members of the European Union. But at the same time, I think we were also one of the more constructive members of the European Union. We were a very powerful supporter of enlargement of the EU because we saw this as a European project rather than just a Western European project. We were very vocal in the debate about how to reform the European Union, how to develop the single market, how to develop the institutions and so on. So I think that while we have a reputation for being Eurosceptic, we actually wanted to engage in a very constructive and positive way. And any other member state, whether Eurosceptic or not, we would engage with in order to build support for what we saw as good reforms. Does that answer your question?
Okay, because I'm such a nice moderator and president, I will allow for one more question, and I'm so confident in the ambassador's ability to concisely and thoughtfully answer it. Yes.
I actually have two small ones.
No.
What do you think of the allegations about Russian interference in the elections in the UK?
Well, I mean, I haven't seen the report on that because it hasn't been published. I think that, you know, in general, there is a very serious question that democracies around the world have got to think about quite urgently. Not just about Russian interference, but about all sorts of ways that given the internet and given other modern communications, outside influences can undermine the foundations of democracy in a country. I mean, this is absolutely fundamental. I mean, if, for example, the vote on the referendum on Brexit in 2016 had been closer, say it had been 49.9 versus 50.1, and it became clear that there had been some external influence on voting patterns in that, it would have multiplied the current difficult debate in the UK by a factor of 10, easily. It would have made life so much more difficult, and it would have massively increased the negative environment that democracy is existing in. And the same is true with elections, with parliamentary elections, for example. If you get a very close-run thing, which might be the case on the 12th of December in the UK, then you have one possible government which could head in that direction, another possible government which could head in that direction. And if you've got an argument, if you've got a convincing argument that there are external factors at play in that, then again you've got a very damaging attack on people's on the credibility of democracy and people's confidence. It's a really important question.
And unfortunately, we have a very good case study to suggest that exactly what the ambassador said is true. Look at the impact of the divisiveness on U.S. politics after the 2016 presidential election and the allegations of Russian interference. We know that the Russians had interfered, but nobody can quantify as to what the exact effect was, but an election that was basically decided by 83,000 votes in 3 Rust Belt states. It's been really, really tough, so I certainly hope you don't have to experience that. I want to mention that Ambassador Garrett received the Officer of the British Empire, and to thank you for your most excellent service today to us in your very, very thoughtful, comprehensive, and concise tour de force, tour de horizon. I hereby, by the power invested in me, appoint you commander of the British Empire, which is the next step up, but only in the hallowed halls of the American University of Central Asia.
Great. I'll spend more time here then.
Great. Thank you so much.